Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello, Warbirders. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Danny McHugh on board. Thank you so much for taking the step to support me. Patreon members, I've got a sweet bonus in the works. I know you'll like it. So that's on its way. So, you've landed at part 2 of this multi-parter on the evolution to the P-47. I'm thinking it'll be a 3-parter, but it might even be a 4, so we'll see where the story takes us. If you haven't heard it, you should probably back up and listen to part 1 on the P-35. But if you're not able, here's a bit of a recap for everyone. Last time on the Thunderstorm series, we began by tracing the unbelievable story of Alexander de Seversky, the one-legged Russian nobleman turned aviator whose life was basically an action novel with patents. From losing his leg in the First World War to charming and occasionally annoying the U.S. military establishment, he fought, invented, and hustled his way into founding Seversky Aircraft. We followed the company through its early designs all the way to the P-35, one of America's first all-metal, retractable gear, enclosed cockpit fighters. A revolutionary design, but briefly. It served with the 1st Pursuit Group, raced in national competitions, and even turned up in Sweden as the J-9 before meeting its heroic, albeit kind of tragic, end in the Philippines in 1941. And finally, we saw Seversky himself get ousted from his own company, replaced by Wallace Kellett, and saw his creation reborn as the company that we Warbirders are much more likely to recognize, Republic Aviation. Now, I've often used evolution to describe how some Warbirds came about, and the story of the Republic P-43 Lancer is brutally Darwinian. After the departure of Seversky, Republic used its successful P-35 as kind of a breeding stock to grow a series of fledgling prototypes, and then kick them out of the nest to see if any of them would survive. The P-35 was a perfectly respectable, mid-1930s fighter, sleek metal skin, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpit, all very modern by the standards of its day. It was fast enough, maneuverable enough, and a good airplane to ease American pilots out of their biplane nostalgia. But the future was rolling in like a storm front, and the P-35 just couldn't climb high or fast enough to get around it, and a next-generation fighter was needed. So Republic produced a veritable alphabet soup of varieties: the AP-2, AP-7, AP-4, AP-9, and XP-41. And even a carrier-based version called the NF-1. When kicked out of the nest, all of these newly hatched warbirdies plummeted to the ground and were eaten by foxes. I mean, figuratively, you know. Except for one, the AP-4. Why the AP-4? Transplanted Georgian chief designer Kartveli had looked at the P-35 and essentially said, "Okay, but what if it went higher and faster?" And how did he do that? He slapped in a Pratt & Whitney R1830, fitted with a turbo supercharger borrowed from the B-17 program. The turbo let the engine breathe the thin, high-altitude air like it was sea level, and suddenly, Republic wasn't building a better P-35, they were building a prototype for an entirely new generation of high-altitude fighters. If you are unsure of the differences between superchargers and turbo superchargers, it's not just marketing naming hype, and you should check out my episode on the subject. It's part of my Quest for Power series. To clean the AP-4 up for speed, they incorporated fully retractable landing gear, flush riveting, and, at first, a giant prop spinner and very tight cowling that looked amazing. You could check out the pic on the Patreon page. The AP-4 is a good-looking airplane. Imagine a mini P-47 with a sleeker nose, and you've got it. But the tight cowling was not great for cooling, and this was an air-cooled engine. In fact, on the 22nd of March 1939, the overheating engine caught fire in flight and the pilot had to bail out, and the single prototype AP-4 was lost. But this AP-4 had done something important. It had whetted the appetite of the USAAC. They liked the high-climbing, sleek, turbocharged AP-4 enough to order 13 more in May 1939, giving them the testing designation YP-43. Remember that in the American numbering system, X meant experimental and Y meant testing. The YP-43 had some evolutions itself. The aircraft was powered by an R1830-35 14-cylinder air-cooled radial engine with a General Electric B2 turbo supercharger generating 1,200 horsepower and driving a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. As getting cooling air in had been a problem on the AP-4, there were changes made there. The engine air intake was moved from the port wing to under the engine. To make this fit, the cowling was stretched, resulting in the distinctive ovoid, meaning oval, cowling that we'll see later too in the next evolution of this family of warbirds. Hint, hint. They also returned to a razorback fuselage with a tall spine extending back from the canopy, which I presume was due to the conventional design of the time, and which allowed for greater directional stability and structural strength. Armament was 2 synchronized 50 caliber guns in the cowling and a single 50 caliber machine gun in each wing. What it did not have was armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. It also had a problem with yaw on takeoff and landing, which means side-to-side movement, which was remedied by redesigning the tailwheel. The 13 YP-43s were delivered between September 1940 and April 1941, and they frankly entered a weird time in the aircraft's life. For although the new fighter did exceed the original USAAC performance requirements, perhaps those were too modest, because in 1941, with war raging elsewhere, the evolution of fighting aircraft was leaping ahead. And just as the Lancer, which was the decided name for the P-43, was to enter production, it was already clearly obsolete. But the USAAC went ahead and ordered 80 P-40As anyway. Why? Why order something that was already clearly cooked? Well, they did put in a more powerful engine with the Pratt & Whitney R2181 Twin Hornet, which did crank out an impressive 1,400 horsepower. And they upgraded all the guns to 50 calibers, replacing the 30s in the wings. And the Lancer did have decent speed and decent altitude performance. And the marvelous turbo supercharger that could haul it up into the thin, cold air at 30,000 feet. But it also had the same big problems it inherited from its ancestors. No armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It even still had the wet wing fuel system, which made the entire wing structure a fuel tank. This sounds great on paper, but was not great in the field and in the air, where every little jar jiggled and shake can flex the wing and open up a seam. The Lancer had an incontinence problem and leaked fuel mercilessly. So even with all these faults, they continued with production and even added contracts until a total of 272 were built. Why? Because the Lancer could do something that no other aircraft could do. And it had nothing to do with performance or fighting or even flying. What it did was it kept the Republic Company's balance sheet in the black and the assembly line humming while their designers worked on another really interesting looking airplane. So, where did these Lancers go? Most of them were sent to China under Lend-Lease, even though it was a bit of an ordeal to get them to China. Early in 1942, the first Lancers were shipped to Karachi, India. Once at Karachi, the shipping boxes had to be transported to an airfield, uncrated, assembled, and test flown. The process did not proceed rapidly. Karachi was a chaotic place at the time, as Burma was being invaded and about to fall to the Japanese. It was April before the first P-43s were flight tested and ready for delivery to the Chinese pilots for ferrying to China. The AVG, also known as the Flying Tigers, was also involved with the process. Their pilots helped in checking out the Chinese pilots, test flying, and ferrying the P-43s. There was even some question as to if the Tigers should keep at least some of the Lancers. They would certainly be an asset at high altitude, but the leaky, non-self-sealing tanks and the lack of integral armor made the answer a no. Also, the turbocharger was great, as long as it worked, which it sometimes didn't. Even the ferrying process was hit and miss. In April 1942, Robert Lee Scott Jr., a US AAF pilot with the AVG, showed what the Lancer could do with the turbo by clawing up to 44,000 feet and photographing Mount Everest. On the negative side of things, Chinese Air Force veteran pilot Major Zheng Xiaoyu, who had survived many air battles against the Japanese, did not survive a P-43 ferry flight back into China. The plane suddenly caught fire and crashed, killing him. Was it a combination of leaky fuel tanks and faulty turbo supercharger? Maybe. And he wasn't the only one. According to one of my sources, up to 50% of the P-43s flown by Chinese pilots were lost en route, simply in getting them into China. Chinese pilots did appreciate the P-43 at high altitude. The turbo gave it real legs above 30,000 feet, and reconnaissance pilots especially appreciated how it could loiter in the upper regions while staying comfortably above Japanese flak arcs. And in fact, the very first American recon flights over Japanese-occupied territory were in P-43s, with cameras jammed into the fuselage. But at low altitude, the Lancer was a liability. One hit in the wing and fuel could pour out like a sieve. Japanese fighters like the Oscar and Zero could outturn it at will. Even when not punctured by bullets, the wet wings leaked anyway and had to be patched with rubber cement until supplies of that ran out. Due to their small numbers and disadvantages, they were often relegated to single-plane mundane functions, such as weather reconnaissance, communications flights, or even as high-speed cargo or transport plane. Supposedly, a passenger could be crowded into the P-43's baggage compartment, which couldn't have been too comfortable. By late 1942, the Lancer's frontline days were essentially over. The P-40 kept holding the line, and even for photo recon work, the arrival of F-4s, the reconnaissance version of the P-38 fighter, in China nudged out the Lancers. In the end, Lancer engines were used to replace worn-out motors in Douglas C-47s. Seems like a pretty complicated and expensive way to deliver replacement engines to the field. Do you look forward to my new episodes? Why not help me out by joining Patreon? For the cost of a fancy coffee per month, you really encourage me and get extras. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17. I haven't gotten a PayPal tip in a while, guys. What am I doing wrong? Just joking. You can also give me a good review or share me out there on social media. It all helps. Okay, let's dive back in. The P-43 did serve with American combat units, but only briefly and only at home. In the tense months following the Pearl Harbor attack, Lancers flew air defense patrols with the 55th and 20th Pursuit Groups, scanning the Pacific coast for Japanese raiders that thankfully never came. Maybe they helped to reassure a jittery nation. Once the Army Air Forces got a hard look at its unarmored fuel tanks and its fragile turbo plumbing, the P-43 was quietly pulled off alert status and reassigned to training. From that point on, the Lancer became a stateside workhorse, teaching young pilots how to handle turbo superchargers and giving reconnaissance crews their first taste of high-altitude cameras, while its tougher, armor-clad cousins went overseas. 8 P-43s were loaned to the Royal Australian Air Force in 1942 and served with No. 1 Photo Reconnaissance Unit, flying long-range, high-altitude photo reconnaissance missions. And that's really the P-43 story in a nutshell. A fighter that arrived too late to be cutting edge and too early to take advantage of the lessons we'd learned the hard way. But every hour flown, every pilot trained, every recon camera that clicked over Japanese territory, all of that fed straight into Republic's next design. The Lancer was the awkward teenage phase of a lineage that would grow into one of the most successful fighters of the war. And that brings us directly towards where we're headed next in this Thunderstorm series. How this temperamental, high-flying, somewhat fragile stepping stone became the foundation for one of the heavyweight champions of the Allied Air War. If we keep pushing the symbolism of an approaching storm, then at this point the thunderheads have built up and the storm front is approaching. Next time we meet the Jug. Excited? I know I am. Thank you, my Patreons. You guys keep me getting up at 5 a.m. every morning to make this thing happen. Until next time.